He tossed our wedding rings out like they meant nothing after I joked about him in front of our friends at a pre-party. "Hey, Reddit, my name's Sarah, I'm 28, and I work as a chef. I'm in desperate need of some advice here. I'm supposed to be getting married in just 4 days, but I haven't heard a single word from my fiancé, Mark, not even a text. I've tried reaching out every way I can think of, but he's blocked me on everything. He walked out of that pre-party angry, threw our rings away, and hasn't been seen or heard from since. He literally broke things off with me that night in front of all our friends. We decided to have a pre-wedding celebration together rather than separate bachelor and bachelorette parties. I didn't feel comfortable with the wild stuff that usually happens at those parties, so we planned a joint event instead. I figured holding it a week before the wedding was a good idea. I didn't want to be nursing a hangover or feeling off on my big day. I wanted everything to go smoothly. But here I am now, with my wedding just around the corner, and my fiancé is nowhere to be found. I'm honestly terrified. I can't imagine having to cancel this wedding. I love Mark so much, and I'd do anything to get him back. I need advice, desperately. The night of the party, Mark got really upset because I'd made a few playful jokes about him, and our friends joined in too. Everyone laughed, but Mark didn't find it funny at all. He got so worked up, stormed into our room, grabbed our wedding rings, and flung them out the window. I was completely stunned when he told me right then that he was done, that the wedding was off. And, to make things worse, he threw in a reason that floored me, right there in front of all our friends. Now they probably think I deserve to be left at the altar. But there's more to this than just the jokes. Mark found out a secret I'd been keeping from him, something I never thought would come to light. I know it sounds bad, and maybe it was, but I didn't mean for it to end up like this. Now he knows, and I'm completely torn up about it. I'm so afraid I'm going to lose everything I've been dreaming about and working toward. I first met Mark when he came to eat at my restaurant. It was during my staff's lunch break, so the place was pretty empty. I was just sitting there with a new recipe book when he walked in, looking exhausted and starving, not to mention drop-dead handsome. Even though we were technically on break, I didn't have the heart to turn him away, so I made him a meal. Right as he was finishing up and paying, my staff walked back in, and he realized he'd interrupted my break. He apologized over and over, offered to make it up to me, and when I said it was no big deal, he insisted on treating me to lunch. He even suggested we have it at my own restaurant, which made me laugh. I'd been a bit miffed at first, thinking he wanted to take me somewhere else when I owned my own place. True to his word, he showed up the next day, and we had lunch together. It was one of those easy conversations where I found myself sharing things I normally wouldn't with someone I just met. When lunch was over, he asked for my number and promised to call. I remember waiting, excited for that call that evening, but he didn't reach out. He didn't come by the next day either, and I couldn't stop thinking about him. I was so distracted I nearly burned myself in the kitchen. He did end up calling me 2 days later, and we talked for hours. He apologized for not calling as promised the day before. That conversation was really the start of our friendship. For a month, we stayed friends before things turned romantic. We got to know each other's friends, and soon we were spending a lot of time together, especially on weekends when my shop was closed. Mark works as an executive director at his family's company, which is currently run by his brother, James. Somehow, he and James managed to work together without a shred of rivalry. They've kept an amazing bond as brothers. Neither one is interested in taking control from the other or trying to claim ownership. When I first found out that the company's CEO was actually Mark's younger brother, I was surprised. I asked him why he wasn't the one heading the company, and he told me he'd never really been interested in leading the family business. He only worked there because his dad kept pushing him to, and staying in a director role rather than taking on the CEO position meant he could walk away whenever he wanted. I wasn't entirely satisfied with his answer. I've always thought that if you have to do something, even if it's not exactly what you're passionate about, you should go for the top spot anyway. But Mark was perfectly content with his position, and I could tell that nothing I said was going to change his mind. I tried more than once to convince him, but Mark can be incredibly stubborn when he makes up his mind. I guess I get it, though, since I'm pretty stubborn myself. I left home at 17 because I'd made up my mind not to go to college, and I haven't gone back since, not even to visit my parents. My folks loved me dearly, especially being their only child, and they always believed they knew what was best for me. They wanted me to go to a college of their choosing and study to become a doctor. When I refused, they eventually tried to compromise, letting me pick any college I wanted and study whatever I chose. But when I told them I didn't want college at all and wanted to go to culinary school instead, so I could become a chef, they lost it. They were convinced that a chef's life would be difficult and wasn't exactly a lucrative career. I saw things differently. When it became clear they weren't going to budge on the college issue, I ran away. I was barely an adult, had nowhere to go, and only a bit of money I'd taken from home. Those first few days were rough. I slept on the streets and kept moving. I'd hardly traveled before and had only ever gone anywhere with my parents, so I knew next to nothing about getting by on my own. I sold nearly everything I had just to afford food. Fortunately, I met a girl who took me in with her family. Her parents asked about mine, and I lied, saying they were gone, and that my uncle wanted me to work as a maid for some wealthy man. That story earned me their sympathy, and they took me in. I was so grateful. They let me stay, and I got a part-time job so I could save up a little. That girl, Princess, had a brother named Ethan. He was my first boyfriend. Living under the same roof, we had plenty of chances to be together in secret. He was the one who introduced me to everything I know about sex. It was clear he'd had experience, and the irony was that his parents thought he was a saint, destined for seminary school. They had no clue who their son really was. Eventually, they found out about Ethan and me, and they were furious. They threw me out, and I ended up on the streets again, taking all the blame. Luckily, I'd managed to save enough money to rent a room. It was a damp, drafty place that leaked every time it rained. Nights were freezing, especially since I didn't have any bedding, but at that point, I had no other option. I picked up another part-time job as a waitress at a club, and the outfits we wore were short and pretty revealing. I was only 20 back then, though I had the kind of figure that looked more like 26. I'm not exactly proud to admit it, but I did end up sleeping with different men for money. The sex itself wasn't something I enjoyed, but the money? That was a different story. It's wild how much cash men are willing to throw just to spend a night with you. I charged a high price, and they paid. Once I'd saved enough to get by, I moved into a nicer apartment and paid for my cooking classes. Even though I had enough to open my shop after getting certified, I kept seeing men for the extra cash. I guess I got greedy for that easy money. Eventually, I earned my cooking certificate, and yet, I still didn't stop. I kept meeting men, especially older ones, until I crossed paths with a rich, intense guy named Ethan. We met at the club, where I'd go to find clients. He wasn't much older than me, but he was loaded and asked me to be his exclusive mistress. I agreed, lured in by the money. Ethan showered me with cash, and within 2 weeks of meeting him, I'd bought a house and a shop to start my cooking business. The downside was that Ethan was incredibly possessive and aggressive. Anytime he'd check my phone and see messages, even old ones from other guys, he'd explode. He'd beat me up until I was bruised and bloody, then force himself on me, almost as if he was fueled by my pain. Afterwards, he'd apologize, trying to make up for it with extravagant gifts and piles of cash. I stuck around, enduring his abuse for the luxury he provided. After 3 months, I finally reached my breaking point. Ethan almost killed me one night because a guy happened to wink at me while we were at a club. He dragged me home, beat me so badly I barely recognized myself, and forced himself on me as usual. But this time, he didn't stop. He kept beating me, kept going all night long. I blacked out twice. By morning, after he left for a work emergency, I managed to get to a hospital. After I was treated, I went into hiding for 2 weeks. Ethan kept calling, first with apologies, then with threats, but I was done. I wanted him out of my life. Thankfully, he didn't know about the house I'd bought. It was tucked away in a rural area, the last place he'd think to look. After 2 months without any more messages from him, I felt free to start living again. I opened my restaurant, bought all the equipment I needed, and hired some staff. Business was slow at first, but it eventually picked up. Even though the place became a hit locally, I was too afraid to expand, scared Ethan might find me. So, I kept things as they were. I don't work weekends. I keep those as my rest days, though my staff still opens up and serves customers. I never told Mark about Ethan or my past. That part of my life was something I wanted buried. I kept the story about my parents being gone, even with him. I feared that if Mark knew they were alive, he'd start piecing things together about my past, and that's the last thing I wanted. I wanted him to see me as the person he thought I was, this perfect, amazing woman, not the messy, complicated person I'd been. Mark and I had been together for 2 years before he popped the question, and during that time, he was honestly the sweetest boyfriend I could have asked for. Even though I was more than capable of handling my own needs, he always went out of his way to make sure I was happy and to spoil me with gifts. If we weren't hanging out with friends over the weekend, we'd go on dates, and every single one was a blast. I always looked forward to those times. He encouraged me to expand my restaurant, but I kept refusing, telling him that I was simply satisfied with the way things were. He seemed doubtful, but since I wouldn't budge on it, he eventually let it go. Our first real fight happened over a fundraising event that his father's company organized annually. It was a big deal, gathering donations for orphanages across the country, with all sorts of wealthy folks attending. A lot of them didn't care much for the cause but showed up to look good and do their part. But regardless of their reasons, the money still went to help a lot of orphans. Mark invited me to go with him, but I declined. It wasn't because I didn't want to be there with him, I just didn't want to risk running into Ethan, who was also in those wealthy circles. When I kept making up weak excuses, Mark got annoyed and said he'd take his personal assistant instead. I couldn't stand her, she was always eyeing Mark, and it drove me crazy. I'd told him a bunch of times that I didn't want her around, but apparently, his dad had hired her, and she was excellent at her job, so he couldn't fire her over my feelings. I accused him of wanting to cheat on me, and it turned into a big argument. Finally, I agreed to go with him. I couldn't stand the idea of that assistant going with him and people mistaking her as his date. So we went, but the whole time, I was on edge, glancing around to see if Ethan was there so I'd have time to duck out if needed. About halfway through, I still hadn't seen him and started to relax a bit. Mark figured my nerves were from being surrounded by people I'd only seen on TV or social media. He did his best to help me settle in and introduced me to a few people, but then he got called over to talk to a business partner. Left alone, I sipped my champagne slowly, trying to avoid getting tipsy. Then, a man sat down beside me, raised his glass to mine, and when I looked closer, I was shocked, he looked just like Mark. Until that moment, I'd only heard about Mark's brother, never actually met him since he was usually working at the company's headquarters abroad. When he introduced himself, I put it together and realized who he was. I tried to keep things polite, but he started flirting with me right off the bat. I guessed he didn't realize I was his brother's girlfriend, and just as I was about to clear that up, Mark came back. He joked with his brother, telling him to back off from his woman. James, now fully aware of who I was, didn't ease up on the flirting. I could tell he was genuinely interested in me, though Mark seemed to think it was all in fun. I figured I'd be able to put James behind me after the event, so I just smiled and went along with it. But I was so wrong. James showed up at my restaurant the following week and kept up his flirty behavior. I told him plainly that I was with his brother and didn't appreciate his advances, but he ignored that completely. Every morning, he sent flowers to my restaurant, and even to my house, with notes attached, complimenting my looks or hinting at his attraction. Sometimes, he sent extravagant gifts like dresses, shoes, or jewelry. I didn't mention anything to Mark about James's advances because I didn't want to spark any conflict between him and his brother. Mark adored James, so I decided to just go along with the gifts, hoping they'd stop on their own. Eventually, James asked me out for lunch, and I agreed, intending to tell him to stop with the presents. But the lunch turned out to be so much fun that I ended up accepting another invite for dinner. James had a charm about him, he was effortlessly flattering and had this way of making me feel beautiful. Now, Mark has always told me I'm beautiful, and I've received compliments from others too, but somehow, hearing it from James felt different. Before I knew it, I was spending more time with James than with Mark. I'd make up excuses about work just to sneak away and see him. I didn't tell Mark because, even though he'd want us to get along, it would raise questions if he knew I was seeing his brother that often. Eventually, things crossed the line, and I ended up in bed with James. The first time was a drunken accident. He called one evening, sounding down and saying he needed someone to talk to, specifically me. He asked if he could come over, and I couldn't bring myself to turn him down. He showed up with drinks, and we spent the night talking and drinking. Before long, I was pretty tipsy, and everything afterward happened in a blur. The next thing I knew, I woke up in bed beside James, both of us undressed. I begged him to keep it a secret and told him that it could never happen again, reminding him that I was with his brother. He agreed, for a while. He stayed away for a week, but then he came back, saying he wanted us to keep things casual since I wasn't married to Mark yet. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I knew it was wrong, and I honestly didn't know why I went along with it. I loved Mark deeply and wasn't in love with James, but I kept ending up in bed with him. I even stopped being intimate with Mark, thinking that somehow, it would lessen my guilt. When my 28th birthday rolled around, Mark proposed to me. I'd planned for a quiet day, just staying in and enjoying a cake I'd baked, but Mark insisted on taking me out for dinner. He set everything up, I only had to show up. When we were seated, and our order was supposed to arrive, the plate held a single question: will you marry me? I was thrilled and felt tears welling up. I love Mark, and spending my life with him was my biggest dream. We decided to set the wedding date for 2 months later, so we'd have enough time to make everything perfect. It was my suggestion, and Mark was all in, as long as we ended up married. James wasn't too pleased when he found out Mark had proposed, but I didn't care. To me, what James and I had was just fooling around, and my relationship with Mark was none of his concern. But then I heard that James was trying to sabotage things, planting doubts in Mark's mind about marrying me. I was furious and threatened to cut things off if he didn't stop trying to ruin my relationship with his brother. He finally agreed to drop it and promised not to say anything to Mark again. Things took a turn for the worse when I unexpectedly ran into Ethan again. It turns out he was friends with James, and he'd seen us together. James had apparently told him all about Mark and me, and even about our own involvement. Maybe he was bragging about his ability to charm any woman, but he didn't realize he was setting a trap for me. How do I know all this? Ethan showed up and threatened me with what he knew about James and me. I ended up sleeping with Ethan again, just to keep him quiet. Trying to juggle 2 guys on the side while managing my real relationship was exhausting, but I couldn't let Mark find out about either of them. The only way to keep them both quiet was to give in. Mark began to suspect something when he found a pair of earrings he'd bought for me at James's place. When he asked me about them, I lied, saying they weren't mine. He didn't press the issue at the time, and I assumed he'd forgotten about it, until the day he suggested we go out for lunch with his parents and asked me to wear that exact pair of earrings. I had to come up with an excuse fast, saying I had another pair in mind. I don't know if he believed me, but my gut told me he didn't. Mark hated confrontation, so he kept quiet, but he was distant and unusually reserved during lunch, which his parents even noticed. A few days later, Mark began arranging dates for James. He didn't even have to do much since their mom took care of it. Mark had simply mentioned that since he was getting married, it was time for James to settle down too. James, who only wanted casual flings, grew frustrated with Mark's attempts to set him up. I could tell James was starting to wonder if his brother knew more than he let on about his casual lifestyle. With our wedding approaching, Mark and I began planning, though it was mostly me doing all the work. He was just going along with my choices. Ever since the incident with the earrings, he'd been acting strangely around me, but I was afraid to ask why. I didn't want to hear an answer I wouldn't like. Thankfully, Ethan eventually left town, which was a huge relief. James and I kept up our affair, though. I told him that once I was married, we'd have to end it, and he agreed, saying he didn't mess around with married women anyway. I set up our pre-wedding party, sent out invites to our friends, mostly people from my cooking classes, and did everything I could to make sure it went smoothly. The day before the party, Mark caught me off guard with a strange question. He asked me how I felt about cheating, especially in long-term relationships. I gave him the answer I thought anyone would to avoid suspicion, saying that I'd never tolerate cheating and probably wouldn't forgive him if he ever did it. Mark nodded, agreeing with me, and when I asked why he'd brought it up, he said he knew someone in that situation and their partner was asking for advice. His answer calmed me down, and I figured he wasn't suspecting me. The day of the pre-party arrived, and despite Mark's odd mood, I was excited. I dove right into the fun, even joining in on the games my friends were playing. At one point, I was dared to dance seductively with Mark. He just stood there watching as I moved. My time working at the club had given me some moves, thanks to a stripper friend who taught me, so dancing for Mark wasn't a problem. He didn't crack a smile or react much, he just watched me. I made a mental note to ask him what was wrong after the party, but for the moment, I decided to keep enjoying myself. Soon, we were all joking and talking about sex after marriage, with the guys joining in and laughing at our silly marriage jokes. Then, one of my friends threw out a question as a joke. She asked what I'd do if, after we got married, Mark couldn't satisfy me and I found someone else who could. It was all meant in fun, and we were just goofing around. Everyone laughed, everyone except Mark. He sat there in silence, and I should have taken that as a warning. But instead, I went along with it, saying that I was sure Mark would do fine but that if he didn't, I'd probably find an assistant for him. I meant it as a joke, and the guys all laughed because they understood it was one. But Mark didn't take it that way. Without a word, he got up, walked into our room, and returned with our wedding rings, the ones we bought together right after he proposed. And then, he just threw them out the window. I was stunned. He looked at me and, right in front of our friends, said he was done with our relationship. He told me he'd thought he could handle all the lies I'd told because he'd been stupidly hoping that marriage would somehow change me, that's how deeply he loved me. But after hearing my jokes, he said he realized he couldn't go through with it, couldn't marry someone who thought it was normal to cheat on him, with his own brother and his friend. I was completely speechless. Somehow, Mark knew. He'd figured out everything I thought was hidden. Turns out, he'd seen a woman who looked a lot like me on one of his work trips, and that had prompted him to quietly investigate me, long before he found that earring at James's place. He'd uncovered everything, the lies about my parents, the story I'd made up about how I got the money for my business, and the fact that I was cheating on him with both his brother and his brother's friend, Ethan, who also happened to be my ex. He looked at me with pure disgust, shook his head, and walked out. I barely noticed our friends whispering around us or the fact that everyone had heard everything. All I could focus on was that Mark had just broken up with me a week before our wedding, and I was losing the only man I'd ever truly loved. It felt surreal, like I was in some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. It's been 3 days since that night, and I still haven't heard a single word from Mark. He's blocked me on every platform. I'm terrified, I can't imagine my life without him. I'm desperate for advice on how to fix this mess and get him back. Since this all happened, I've been reading comments from people online, and it's crushing to see what they think of me. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but reading those harsh, painful words has forced me to face just how selfish and foolish I've been. I actually thought I could lead a double life, cheat on Mark, and still keep him in my life. I even went so far as to put on my wedding dress, go to the church, and wait all day for him, but he never showed. I did the same thing the next day, and the day after, until finally, I had to accept the truth and leave. My life feels shattered. I destroyed the one truly good thing I had. I should have never kept those secrets from Mark. I should have told him everything about my past, about James's relentless advances, and about Ethan's threats. Maybe if I'd been honest, I wouldn't be in this mess. By now, I could have been wearing my wedding ring, planning a future with Mark. I spent all day searching for the rings Mark threw, and eventually, I found them. It felt bittersweet, holding the ring I'd fallen in love with the moment I saw it. But now, it doesn't even fit. It's like I've lost weight from all this stress. I've even shattered every mirror in my house because I can't stand to look at myself. The shame I feel is just too overwhelming. My heart is shattered. I punish myself mentally every day, agonizing over every mistake I made. I'm completely alone, no one is on my side. I wish I hadn't hurt Mark as deeply as I did. I don't know what he might have said or done with James after everything came out, but given how close they are, I imagine they'll patch things up eventually. As for my family, they're probably better off not knowing who I've become. I cut them out of my life when I was 17, so by now, they likely think I'm dead. And after everything I've done, sleeping with men for money, the secrets and lies, I feel like I'm covered in a stain that won't wash off. No amount of scrubbing can erase the shame. I can hardly believe that, after all my mistakes, I somehow found a man like Mark who loved me unconditionally. He wanted to marry me despite my flaws, and I still managed to throw it all away. These last few weeks have been torture. I'm constantly lost in self-reflection, crying until I feel like there's nothing left inside me. The pain is endless, like an open wound that never heals. Each day, I wake up to the harsh reminder that Mark is out of my life. Even my dreams won't let me escape, they're filled with memories of him, of the life we might have had. It's unbearable because I know this is all my fault. I created this nightmare, and there's no way out. I haven't opened my restaurant in weeks. My customers are probably long gone, but I can't bring myself to care. In a few minutes, I lost everything worth living for. If I could, I'd do anything to take back my mistakes, but it's too late. I'm stuck with this guilt and pain forever, and this life feels worse than any hell I could imagine. Update. Hey, Reddit. It's me again, and this may be my last post. I just wanted to say thank you for all the responses, even the tough ones. Even the anger and insults gave me something, a reaction, some proof that I still exist to someone, even if only in their frustration. My life hasn't changed. Nothing's gotten better. I'm still without Mark, and without him, nothing else feels like it matters. I keep replaying everything in my head, and I know I'll never forgive myself. Whoever said time heals all wounds must never have felt this way, because with each passing day, the pain only gets worse. It feels like there's a weight pressing on my chest that just keeps growing, making it harder to breathe. Waking up every morning and realizing I've lost Mark feels like a fresh wound each time. My dreams torment me, too. They're full of memories of Mark and visions of the life we might have shared if I'd just made better choices. But now, I know that life is gone forever. Mark will eventually move on, find someone who'll love him the way he deserves. The thought of him with another woman fills me with dread, but I know he deserves happiness. As for me, I can't see a way out of this misery. I'll carry this guilt, this pain, for the rest of my life, and if that somehow makes up even a fraction for what I put Mark through, I'll accept it. I wish I could tell him all this, but I know he wouldn't want to hear it, and I have no way of reaching him even if he did. So, I guess this is goodbye. Thank you, everyone, for listening.